You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast produced by Veeran Strategies and featuring conversations with fascinating and impactful men and women who have shaped our world, our communities, and our history. My name is Robert Vane, Principal of Veeran Strategies, and your host for our discussion. You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veeran Strategies, a local veteran public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Girl Scouts of Central Indiana, Garmond Construction, Leaders and Legends LLC, the Grand Hall and Conference Center at Historic Union Station, the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn, and McAllister Machinery, your friendly neighborhood Caterpillar dealer. You may find all your sales and rental equipment needs at McAllister.com. We are pleased to announce our podcast is now a member of the All Indiana Podcast Network in partnership with Wish TV. You may find Leaders and Legends at allindianapodcastnetwork.com. Thinking of starting a podcast or need to host a public meeting? Let Leaders and Legends LLC be your partner as you look for new ways to communicate your message. Please contact Chris Spangle and me at leadersandlegends.net. Thank you for joining us on the Leaders and Legends podcast. Our guest today is Michael Dobbs. Mr. Dobbs is a former journalist and Moscow bureau chief for the Washington Post, who was literally standing next to the tank that Russian leader Boris Yeltsin climbed aboard when he denounced the coup attempt against Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev in August 1991. If you visit his website, michaeldobbsbooks.com, there's a picture of him covering this amazing event. Michael is also a best-selling historian who, as I could tell you from reading 3 of his books, is a phenomenal writer. His book on the Cuban Missile Crisis, 1 Minute to Midnight, is the best account of that watershed event that I've ever read. And if you want a terrific history of how the West transitioned from World War II to the Cold War, then please read 6 Months in 1945. Michael also taught courses at Princeton, the University of Michigan, and Georgetown University. We are grateful and fortunate to have Michael on the podcast today to discuss his latest book, King Richard, Nixon and Watergate, An American Tragedy. Mr. Dobbs' book focuses on the first 100 days after Nixon's second inaugural in January 1973. As an unabashed Nixon fan, I hope that's okay, Mr. Dobbs, I couldn't wait to read this book, and it certainly doesn't disappoint. It's wonderful. USA Today gave it 4 stars out of 4, and the New York Times called it intimate and extraordinary. Our main goal, besides discussing this book, is to make Mr. Dobbs enjoy this interview so much that he'll agree to come back to discuss his other works. Thank you for coming on the Leaders and Legends podcast, Michael.
Well, thanks so much for having me, Robert. It's good to be here.
We love your accent already. We know you're from Europe. Talk just to take a little bit of time and tell the Leaders and Legends audience how you matriculated to the United States.
Well, I was brought up and educated in the UK. Actually, I was born in Belfast, Northern Ireland. My dad was a diplomat, and he spent a lot of his time in the Soviet Union. I became a journalist, and as serendipity would have it, I happened to be in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union when the whole communist system collapsed around us. And so that was a tremendous story for a reporter to cover. And I covered it for the Washington Post, first as a freelance and then as their correspondent in Eastern Europe and Moscow. And that's how I came to the United States.
Somewhat ironic that you worked at the Washington Post and then end up writing a book about Richard Nixon.
A little, I guess. Yeah. I mean, I was brought up with the legends of the Washington Post and particularly the legends of Watergate. Actually, when I was in Poland in 1981, Bob Woodward came out to Poland because he was interested in seeing what was going on there. And we spent a lot of time together traveling around the country, and the Poles couldn't understand why this famous journalist had come out to Poland. He just actually wanted to see what was going on. So I got to know Bob during that period, and then later, of course, at the Washington Post as well.
For those of you who aren't old enough or haven't really studied the period, before we move on to President Nixon, it's fair to point out that Poland was the epicenter of the political Cold War world in the late 70s, early 80s. What was it like to be there as the Poles rose up spiritually as much as anything, especially after Pope John Paul was installed as pontiff in 1979? What was it like to be there in that moment?
Right. Well, I happened to have the sheer good luck to be in Poland in August of 1980 when the Lenin shipyard, a very symbolic name, went on strike.
Is that Gdansk?
Their strike in Gdansk, and their strike resulted in the rise of the Solidarity Trade Union movement, and eventually, I mean, those events led to the collapse of communism a decade later. And for a young reporter, it was an amazing event to cover because I'd never been able before to get close to, workers, for example. The workers, you could interview them, but there was always a government minder in tow, so you couldn't have free conversations with workers or anyone else really in a country like Poland. And for the first time in my career covering communist countries, I was able to, talk to ordinary people, particularly workers in the case of the Lenin shipyard, and understand how they really felt. It was like, I've described it as being a spectator in a play, and you're watching the play, and then suddenly you can go behind the scenes and see how the production is really happening.
And Gdansk itself is such an interesting city. It's almost kind of a small microcosm of 20th century history in the sense that it was, and correct me if my history is wrong here, but it was Danzig. It was part of the Imperial Germany, became a free city, part of the Polish corridor after the Treaty of Versailles, then became part of Poland, communist Poland, and then really was where everybody's eyes turned in the late 70s, early 80s, as it became clear that technology, as much as anything, plus in the case of Poland and Catholicism, religion, was going to play an important role towards what turned out to be the twilight of the Cold War.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, Danzig, or as it was known in Poland, Gdansk, was the place where the Second World War started because Hitler wanted to occupy that corridor of Polish land, and he did. So that's how World War II started. And then later it became equally symbolic for the role it played in the collapse of communism in 1980, which I was privileged to witness personally.
The fascination with Richard Nixon generally and Watergate specifically seems relatively unabated during the past 47 years. We're actually going to post this podcast on August 9th, which is the anniversary of Nixon's resignation being effective. What are your thoughts as to why him and the event still stay so fresh?
Well, Nixon's a fascinating person. I mean, as I discovered when I did the research for this book, he's a more contradictory, complex person than, some of the kind of cardboard cutout versions of Nixon have made him appear. And, he was a man who came up from virtually nothing. He was born to a poor Quaker family out in California. His father was a struggling farmer and then became a struggling grocer. So everything that Nixon achieved in his life, he achieved through his own efforts. This is a story of a man who made himself, rose all the way to becoming president, and then destroyed himself. So, to my mind, that is the story of, Shakespearean grandeur. And that's, the story that I've tried to capture in this book. And one of the reasons why I called my book King Richard, to evoke this idea of a Shakespearean tragedy.
You mentioned in your book how Hannah Nixon, Richard's mother, named her sons after English kings, except for poor Donald. So I'm not sure where she could have named him Henry, I guess, and didn't. And so Nixon was named after Richard the Lionheart. And much like Richard the Lionheart, who was king of England from 1189 to 1199, Richard the Lionheart made his bones overseas, spent very little time in England, I think 6 months. And Nixon very much made his reputation overseas when it came to foreign policy. He's still rated, he and his partner Kissinger are still rated as the top, or not at the, or just at the top when it comes to foreign affairs. Why do you think that aspect of the presidency, before we get to Watergate, that aspect of the presidency fascinated Nixon so much?
Well, Nixon agreed with his rival and friend, Jack Kennedy, that the really important thing that a president could do was in the field of foreign policy. And domestic policy didn't really interest him. I said he was born out in California, and, so he looked out from the beach at San Clemente, where he had his one of his houses. He looked out across the Pacific Ocean in the direction of China, which was then a completely closed totalitarian society. And he dreamed of remaking the world by bringing China into the global system. And it was an incredibly bold gamble, which, has shaped the world in which we live in today. I mean, some people would say, well, it was not such a great idea with hindsight to bring China into the world system. But, of course, Nixon couldn't tell the kind of crises we'd be going through 50 years later. But it does show that, Nixon was a man of global ambitions. And, that's very much represented by his policy towards China, which, by the way, he used in order to reach an arms agreement with the Soviet Union. So it wasn't just a matter of a new China policy. It was using that China policy to affect U.S. relations with the other superpower, the Soviet Union. So he had an understanding of how all these different global parts fitted together. And, it's often said that it was only Nixon who could go to China, because if a Democratic president had tried to do the same thing, he would have been criticized from the right, from the Republican Party. So it needed someone with Nixon's proven anti-communist credentials to take this very bold strategic foreign policy move.
And it showed some additional courage, because even Nixon was criticized from the right. William F. Buckley was not a fan. There were very many folks on the Republican right who thought it was a terrible mistake. Nixon proved them all wrong, and actually created a metaphor. Nixon to China is used to describe a lot of other bold decisions by people, courageous decisions. You subtitled your book "An American Tragedy." What do you think are the most tragic elements of this tragedy of Watergate and Nixon's fall?
Well, actually, that phrase, "an American tragedy," was it's not something I invented, but both Kissinger and Gerald Ford used that phrase to describe the torment that Nixon went through as a result of Watergate, and the country went through as a result of Watergate. So you can apply that both to Nixon's own experience, but you can also apply it to the country's experience. I mean, I was thinking of the sort of Shakespearean tragedy of this man who rises to great heights through his own efforts, and then through some kind of fatal flaw brings himself down. And, very often in politics, the qualities that you need to rise to the top are not the same qualities you need to govern. And, Nixon was somebody who, he spent a lot of his life trying to get even with his enemies. He had carried with him a lot of resentments, and these hatreds and resentments formed part of his personal drive that resulted in him becoming president of the United States. But also, in my view, it set in motion the forces that led to his resignation as president.
On some level, did President Nixon think that he was just doing things that everybody does, like all presidents do? We all bug, or we all have these sort of surreptitious initiatives to be kind. And that, why am I being singled out for what I did? Lyndon Johnson bugged, John F. Kennedy bugged. I mean, why me?
Yeah, well, that was certainly Nixon's logic. If you try to get inside his mind, and as he explained it at the time and subsequently, he thought that the Kennedys got away with an awful lot, and that including bugging of political opponents. And he felt he was just, playing the same game that his predecessors had. I mean, one difference was that previous presidents had used the FBI to, spy on their political opponents. And J. Edgar Hoover decided that he wasn't going to do that anymore. So Nixon was deprived of the FBI as a weapon to use against his political enemies. And so therefore he began running these, or having people on his behalf run these operations for him out of the White House, which, was proved to be very damaging for him, because he could no longer claim any plausible deniability, and the legality came into question.
And we'll ask about the plumbers here in just a little bit. One of the great names of all time. When you read, it's kind of like, I have this feeling when I read a book or watch a documentary about John F. Kennedy, and you see him get off the plane in Dallas, and you just want to go, just get back on. Like, just don't do this. And you read about Watergate, and any reasonable person, historian, would count Nixon as one of the most intelligent presidents in American history. He was phenomenally intelligent. And you just, as you read it, as it starts to unfold, you start to think, how could someone so smart do something so stupid and then keep doing it and not realize how stupid it is? Did that thought come through your mind as you were researching and writing this book? Like, man, you're doing such wonderful things. You're about to win, I think, 521 electoral votes in 1972. Like, you don't need to do this. You're going to win anyway, but
right.
You're doing it.
Well, I mean, we have the benefit of hindsight, of course. And, 50 years later, you can identify all these fatal turning points and mistakes, but it's more difficult to do so if you're right in the middle of them. And events have a way of sort of just proceeding, and you're caught up in them. And, you don't have the same benefit that historians do, which is to be able to look at everything and know how things turned out. I mean, in my books in general, have tried to write history as it actually took place. That, in other words, I think there was some famous philosopher who said that history is lived forwards but written backwards. By that he means that historians sort of begin with their own vantage point many years later, but I have tried to put readers back into the moment and show that, just try to describe how one event led to another event. And, that's, if you think about it, is how history is actually unfolds. Nixon didn't have the same advantage that historians have when they can, pick, precisely point to all the mistakes he made.
Well, your point about the historians, we should probably mention that history and the treatment of Nixon by historians and in history was a driving force for the installation of the tape system. Is that correct?
Well, very much so. Actually, previous presidents had taping systems. Kennedy had a taping system. Johnson had a taping system. When Nixon came to office, he had Johnson's taping system ripped out because he didn't want to be taped. But then after a couple of years, he decided, well, it would be useful to have a historical record because he wanted to write his own memoirs and get the credit that he felt that he deserved for these foreign policy initiatives that we've been talking about. And so, and he wanted to, there was a kind of rivalry with people like Kissinger. I mean, Kissinger was his partner, but was also his rival when it came to, claiming credit for all these different initiatives. So Nixon wanted to have his own private record. Now, Nixon was a bit of a klutz technologically, to put it mildly. He, nobody trusted him to start a tape recording by himself. So they came up with the brilliant idea, they thought at the time, but it proved to be disastrous, to install a taping system that didn't have an on-off switch. It would just start recording whenever Nixon went into a room or picked up a phone. And that was really the difference between Nixon's taping system and Kennedy's or Johnson's, because in the case of those two earlier presidents, they turned the system on. But Nixon's system recorded absolutely everything, the good, the bad, the ugly, the criminal. And as a result, it's a record of what was taking place in the White House, what was going through Nixon's own mind at crucial moments, that is really unrivaled in American history. And we're never going to get such a record again because no other American president is ever going to tape himself the way Nixon did. I think that's I can be very confident about that prediction.
Didn't that come up during the Iran-Contra hearings in the late 80s, in the Ronald Reagan's second term, when they were investigating that? Someone actually asked, is there a taping system in the Oval Office? And the witness just started laughing and like, no, there's not.
No, I mean, of course, with Trump, we have all his tweets, but, tweets are very different to tapes. These tapes of Nixon's were of private moments that he never intended to share with anybody. Whereas obviously Trump's tweets are part of his whole, public persona.
Which gave us the term in the mid 70s of expletive deleted.
Right. That comes from people who can't remember Watergate, when Nixon was forced to release transcripts of some of the tapes, but he removed all the bad language. So, the bad language was usually things like goddamn. Wasn't terrible, but it was, but it could offend people out in Middle America, I guess. And so instead of putting in the bad language, they put in phrases like expletive deleted, which was actually sort of, you imagine something much worse than goddamn or whatever it was that Nixon had said.
I just finished reading Thomas Schwartz's book on Henry Kissinger. It's really good. It's terrific. And it's interesting to put his book together with yours to make the case how impactful the Pentagon Papers leak was to the Nixon administration's mentality. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I haven't read that book, but yes, I think that the leak of the Pentagon Papers to the New York Times 50 years ago this year did help lead directly to Watergate, because Nixon and Kissinger were alarmed that all these government secrets were leaking out, and they worked each other up into a frenzy, and they decided they had to do something about it. And so that was the origin of the unit that you've referred to as the plumbers, that was widely referred to as the plumbers, although its official name was something different. It was something like the investigative unit or something. But this group of people was formed, whose job it was to plug all these leaks, beginning with the leak of the Pentagon Papers. So you can draw a direct line between the efforts to stop these government leaks that resulted from the Pentagon Papers right through to Watergate.
So you believe that's the start of the Watergate break-in, the Watergate conspiracy is the creation of the Plumbers Union to stop leaks, which had its genesis not only in the secretiveness and the obsessiveness with leaks that already existed in the Nixon administration, but because of the actions of Daniel Ellsberg. Part of the plumber's duties or sin is the break-in of Ellsberg's psychiatrist, a fellow, Lewis Fielding, I think was his name.
Right.
And it was the same cast of characters to a large extent that broke into the psychiatrist office that eventually bungled the Watergate burglary.
Right. Gordon Liddy, Howard Hunt were the leaders of that break-in of the Daniel Ellsberg psychiatrist's office out in Beverly Hills, actually. And so they were the same people who masterminded the break into the Watergate a couple of years later. Now, the question is, why did Nixon cover up Watergate, or why did he think it was necessary to cover up that crime? And he could have pushed responsibility for Watergate onto his re-election committee, headed by John Mitchell. The reason he didn't, or the reason that it was impossible for him to separate himself and the White House from Watergate, was that there'd been all these previous break-ins, the most notable of which was the break-in of the offices of the Daniel Ellsberg psychiatrist. So Nixon feared that if he came clean over Watergate, that would expose some of these earlier break-ins. And I think that really led to what was actually the most dangerous part of the Watergate for Nixon was not the original break-in, but the attempts to cover it up later. And that was what motivated Nixon's determination to cover up Watergate.
Nixon's close friend, John Mitchell, was previously Attorney General, but was then head of the committee to re-elect the president, which was nicknamed CREEP. Was there a reluctance on Nixon's behalf to throw things over to the campaign, not only for the reasons that you state and that you articulate in the book, but also because of his personal friendship with Mitchell and Nixon's seeming inability to be confrontational in one-on-one situations?
Right. I think that's also true that John Mitchell was the big heavyweight in the government next to Nixon. He'd been a law partner of Nixon before, and Nixon was reluctant to throw Mitchell to the wolves. I think this is another something that distinguished Nixon from Trump, is that Nixon there's a phrase of a British Prime Minister, William Gladstone, who said that in order to be a good prime minister, you have to be a good butcher. And Nixon wasn't a very good butcher. He was unwilling to sacrifice people close to him, largely for personal psychological reasons, perhaps. And he was certainly very late in deciding that he had to get rid of Mitchell and some of the other people close to him in the White House.
Which is one of the reasons why H.R. Haldeman, his chief of staff, had a reputation for being such a wonderful butcher, a willing butcher.
Yeah, I mean, Nixon used other people to do his dirty work for him, particularly his chief of staff, Bob Haldeman. And the irony, of course, is that eventually Nixon had to get rid of Haldeman himself, which is right at the end of my book. And, it was a very, very painful decision for him.
You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, a local veteran public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Girl Scouts of Central Indiana, Garmond Construction, Leaders and Legends LLC, the Grand Hall and Conference Center at Historic Union Station, the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn, and McAllister Machinery, your friendly neighborhood Caterpillar dealer. Our guest on the Leaders and Legends podcast is Michael Dobbs, former journalist and a brilliant historian, if I may say so, based on my reading of your books, which are superb. Please visit his website, michaeldobbsbooks.com. We are discussing his latest effort, King Richard, Nixon and Watergate, an American Tragedy. And Mr. Dobbs's book focuses on the first 100 days after Nixon's second inaugural in January 1973. At what point, if any, was the Watergate scandal survivable for Nixon? Or once James McCord, one of the burglars, sent his letter to Judge Sirica saying that there's a cover-up and it was being ordered by higher-ups and he's just a scapegoat, was it too late at that point?
No, I don't think it was too late. I think he would have been severely wounded, certainly, politically, but I think he could have survived as president. I think it was survivable up until the time that the secret of his taping system came out. And he could have destroyed the tapes, but he decided to keep them because he thought that he could control them and that they would never be made public. He could just use them for his memoirs. But it was really this taping system that determined who was telling the truth. Was it Nixon or was it his accusers, principally John Dean? And without those smoking guns that the tape represented, and which were only extracted from Nixon by a unanimous Supreme Court decision in 1974, I think Nixon could have made it to the end of his presidency. Certainly, severely wounded, but he would not have been forced to resign because there wouldn't have been a critical mass of evidence that persuaded sufficient numbers of congressmen and senators that he had to go, particularly Republican senators and congressmen.
So Michael Dobbs is counselor to the president, and he's in the Oval Office, and the president turns to you and says, "Should I burn the tapes?" You would have told him?
Well, it depends when you'd asked me that and whether I was being, politically calculating or whether I was being, sort of based on, as a historian, of course, I would not recommend him to burn the tapes because these tapes are a marvelous historical document. But for his sheer political survival, I guess I would have, with hindsight, because it's difficult to try to put yourself back into the actual event without, all this historical knowledge that we now have. But with hindsight, I would certainly have advised him to burn the tapes in order to survive politically.
And one of the interesting things about the tapes is the very low number of people who knew that all these places had been bugged, for lack of a better term, were recording. It was Nixon, it was Haldeman, it was Alexander Butterfield, who was the aide who had to reveal the existence of the tapes as part of the Watergate hearings. It's always funny. The question to Butterfield was asked by Fred Thompson, who ended up playing the district attorney on Law and Order and being a United States senator. But Kissinger didn't know. Pat Nixon didn't know. I don't know if Ehrlichman knew, but all these, the Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, nobody knew that their conversations were being recorded. So they must have been mortified collectively when the tapes were made public.
Right. Only 4 or 5 people close to Nixon in the White House knew about it, plus the Secret Service officers whose job it was to retrieve the tapes, change the tapes, and store the tapes. So there were 4 or 5 Secret Service officers who knew about it. Yeah, I think they were mortified. I mean, for example, Henry Kissinger, who's always, run down the tapes as a historical source, he's claimed that, they're not very interesting. Of course, he would say that a bit because he doesn't come across very well in the tapes. He comes across as Mr. Sycophant number 1.
Yeah, he's pretty obsequious if you listen to these tapes, that's for sure.
Yeah, he's sort of constantly sucking up to Nixon and playing a double game, because he's sucking up to Nixon and then running him down in private conversations with journalists and others.
Is it perhaps the very, very definition of irony that one of the most secretive men ever to rise to high office, not just presidency, but high office in the history of the world, has left this amazing primary source material? And Nixon fought hard to keep his tapes both out of the public eye and ownership of them as a private citizen. And correct my history, but didn't he eventually prevail in some regard with regard to ownership of the tapes?
Well, there was a long battle for control of the tapes, which eventually, I guess it was after Nixon's death, the government or the National Archives won on behalf of historians. And, deal was done with the family, basically saying that, if it was a purely personal matter, conversation between Nixon and family members that related to purely personal matters, then the Nixon family would have the right to withhold that. But everything else was released. And it took about 40 years for all the tapes to become public. I mean, a number of the tapes were released at the time as a result of court orders, the Supreme Court order, but the vast bulk of them, I'd say 95% of them, only were only released over the last 10 years. And really that made it possible for me to write the book that I was able to write.
Is it hard as a historian? Is it difficult to get a handle on everything because there's just so much?
Absolutely. I mean, it's you can, and I think it really presents a challenge to Nixon biographers, because there's so much, for the lack of a better term, Nixoniana, Nixon materials, that no one person can possibly get a handle on all of this. And that is part of the reason why I chose to focus on a shorter period of time, largely the few months after Nixon's second inaugural, when his entire presidency fell apart. And by focusing on that period of time, I can bring readers into the room, and we get a much more intimate view of Nixon. I sometimes refer it to as, it's as though we're flies on the wall in the Oval Office or the Lincoln Sitting Room or other places around the White House. But a better description might be a bug in the desk, because these literally were bugs in Nixon's desk that, so we're sitting in the room alongside Nixon when he's taking all these decisions, and, talking to people, sometimes about great affairs of state, and sometimes about criminal matters, and sometimes just about, very trivial things that are happening every day. It's the mixture of those three things, I think, that is interesting, actually, and the way he can skip within 5 minutes from, having a conversation about, the big issues of foreign policy to the grubby issues of Watergate, to taking a call from his daughter and, exchanging loving remarks with one of his daughters.
Watched an interview many years ago. It was with Nixon's 1972 opponent, Senator George McGovern, in which McGovern said that Watergate had no bearing on his historic defeat by Nixon. Nixon won 521 electoral votes, and McGovern, I think, won 17. Do you second McGovern's thoughts on this, that one had nothing to do with the other?
Yeah, I think Nixon was headed for a landslide election victory, partly in reaction to the, what many Americans perceived as the excesses of the 60s and the, revulsion against the hippies, the Vietnam War protesters, and so on. So he didn't actually need, the paradox is that he didn't actually need to break into the Watergate to gather all this intelligence on his enemies. He would have won anyway. But again, you have to go back into the mindset of Nixon and his aides when they were preparing to fight that election. And it didn't seem quite as obvious a result as it eventually turned out. First of all, he thought his opponent would not be McGovern, but Muskie, Ed Muskie of Maine, who was a more centrist, moderate figure in the Democrat Party and would probably have been a much more formidable opponent for Nixon. So when the whole idea of gathering all this political intelligence and breaking into the Watergate was formulated, they were imagined a different set of circumstances than those which actually unfolded.
Vietnam seemed to have hung over not only the Nixon administration, the Johnson administration, and I guess you probably would be premature to say it hung over the Kennedy administration. That would be probably overstating it. But it hung over the country as well. It created this entire atmosphere of distrust and lack of faith in government. How important, we mentioned the Pentagon Papers, which was a series of assessments of how the war had been fought. It did not cover the time of Nixon's presidency. But Kissinger, it seemed, was the one who whipped Nixon into a frenzy about the Pentagon Papers and the fact that if we can't keep secrets, then foreign countries won't want to do business with us. How does Vietnam help feed what eventually became Watergate? And as a journalist, putting the two together, what did that do to the country in the sense of who can you trust? And we need the media to hold the government accountable in a way that they never had to before.
Right. I think that Vietnam, because of the divisions it created in America, fed into this us versus them mentality that Nixon became a victim of. I mean, there was a certain point at the height of the anti-war protests that they had to surround the White House with buses, build a barricade around the White House in order to prevent the protesters from gaining access to the White House. And that sort of created in Nixon's mind a sort of sense of being under siege. He tried to break out of that by appealing to what he called the silent majority. But it accentuated in his mind this sort of idea of, this division between the real America and all these hippies and anti-war protesters. And that was another thing that, helped to lead to Watergate. Plus, Vietnam was a huge distraction for him, just in the amount of time that it took. And so, he has also said that he simply didn't have his eye on the ball because he was thinking about Vietnam. He was thinking about re-elected. So he, up until the beginning of 1973, didn't actually spend a lot of time on Watergate. That was mainly his aides, John Dean, who was the legal counsel in the White House. They were, running the cover-up, and Nixon was really a bit detached from all of that.
He also claimed that if Mitchell had been minding the store instead of paying attention to his wife, Martha, who, if anyone in history, I guess maybe other than Lincoln, I wish had a Twitter feed, it would be Martha Mitchell. Mitchell's wife was famously difficult and unable to be controlled, and loudmouth, for lack of a better term, would call journalists in the middle of the night and insult the president and talk about sex and various other dramas. Nixon felt that Mitchell perhaps was so distracted by trying to deal with Martha that he wasn't minding the store. Is that something you believe in as well, or no?
Yeah, I think it's true that, and this is a reminder that, often history is determined by these personal things that are going on. I mean, Napoleon and Josephine, and the impact that Josephine had on Napoleon, and certainly that Martha had on her husband, John Mitchell. Of course, it was a huge distraction for Mitchell. And Nixon was right to say that, Mitchell hadn't really wasn't minding the store at that point. And that was one of the reasons why Mitchell sort of went along with this cockamamie scheme to break into the Watergate, at least in Nixon's mind. And there's probably some truth in that.
Nixon's downfall, if you look at the timeline, if you read your book, especially from the point of the break-in, which is June of 72, there's just a series of significant hammer blows that chip away and eventually destroy the edifice of the cover-up. Of all those, which do you think two or three are the most important? So June of 72, Nixon's riding high, not a shoo-in for re-election, but clearly the favorite. His trip to China happens that year. Trip to the Soviet Union happens that year. Now in October of 72, Kissinger announces, peace is at hand, which turned out to be a bit premature. But as you get through the Watergate break-in, how do the walls start tumbling down? And was it reversible in any way if, say, for example, James McCord keeps his mouth shut, one of the burglars, or Jeb Magruder, who was the deputy at the committee to re-elect the president, keeps his mouth shut?
Right. I mean, I think the pivotal moment or period was the one that I've examined in my book, which is from January of 1973 with Nixon's triumphant re-election and second inaugural through the next 3 or 4 months, when this very disciplined White House, hammered into shape by the Chief of Staff, Bob Haldeman, all unravels, and these Nixon aides, who had all been very loyal to him and loyal to one another, all start turning on each other, and eventually they turn on the president. And that's what I was interested in exploring in this book, precisely this period. I think one of the key moments is, you mentioned James McCord. James McCord was one of the leaders of the burglars, and he faced the prospect of going to jail. He knew how terrible the DC jail was because he'd spent some time there. And the trial of the Watergate burglars began in court in Washington. The judge was a man called John Chirico, he was a Republican, had a very reputation of being a very tough judge. But despite the fact that he was politically aligned with Nixon, he was determined to get to the bottom of this scandal. So he started putting pressure on the defendants. And there was one particular court session in which McCord listened to the number 2 man at the creep, Mitchell's deputy, a man called Jeb Magruder. And Jeb Magruder came into court and he swore under oath that he had nothing to do with Watergate. And McCord thought to himself, well, he knew that from Gordon Liddy that actually Jeb Magruder had authorized the break-in into the Watergate. So McCord begins to think to himself, why should I go to jail for something that we have been ordered to do, and the man who authorized it is still in his plum White House job and is still, his reputation is intact. So that was a very dramatic moment for McCord, and he decided that he wasn't going to carry the can for Jeb Magruder. So he goes to the judge. He says that perjury has been committed in this trial, and that act of Magruder's is kind of like a house of cards. You remove one card, just one at the bottom, and this whole house of cards comes crumbling down. And that's precisely what happened as a result of Magruder's refusal to go along with, McCord's refusal to go along with Jeb Magruder's perjury.
I agree with that completely. To me, that turns everything from being a quote third-rate burglary to becoming capital W Watergate. Is John Dean a hero in your mind?
Well, I've tried to portray people in my books not as heroes or villains, but most of us have combinations of light and dark, of good and bad, and I think that applies to Nixon. It also applies to Dean. I mean, Dean was a loyal functionary. Actually, he was in charge of the cover-up. He was called himself the desk officer of the cover-up.
Mm-hmm.
But as a result of McCord's action in betraying the other burglars, that put Dean in a very difficult position because, Dean was, handling all these hush money payments to the burglars. And Dean is a very smart person, and he realized that he was in legal jeopardy. He was the first of Nixon's aides to understand that he could go to prison as a result of that. So, Dean is, it's a combination of motivations. There's some patriotic motivation, but there's also the motivation of wanting to save himself. And it's very difficult to separate one motivation from another. But I think, it just goes to illustrate that, history is not black and white. History is shades of gray, and people like Dean very much illustrate that.
May I ask another hero question?
Sure.
Is Deep Throat a hero?
Well, Deep Throat was the pseudonym invented by the Washington Post for the deputy head of the FBI, a guy called Mark Felt, who was, the loyal FBI man by day, and by night he was meeting with Bob Woodward and spilling the beans about Watergate. So yeah, I think Mark Felt / Deep Throat is very similar to John Dean. That he's you can describe him as a man of mixed motivations. That on the one hand he was blowing the whistle, but on the other hand he was driven by personal ambition because he wanted to succeed Hoover as director of the FBI, and he thought that by speaking to reporters and by running down the acting head of the FBI, he would have a shot at the top job himself, which was his lifelong dream.
And that really does come through in your book, that aspect of it, which I'd never read before, that Felt was very, very unhappy about not being chosen for the top job.
Yeah, he was a very adept bureaucrat at being able to ruthlessly get even with his rivals and try to grab the top job for himself. Of course, he didn't succeed because, ironically, the people in the White House, including Nixon, suspected him of being a leaker. And so Nixon was not willing to appoint Mark Felt to the top job. So he was never going to get it, but he certainly thought that he had a chance.
I had read this in another book, and I want to ask you about some other Nixon books as well. But Nixon even said it in 73. Lyndon Johnson, I think, dies in January of 73. That when Nixon was going through this, he had no ex-presidents he could turn to. That in one of the few times in American history, there were no living ex-presidents. And there's famous pictures where Lyndon Johnson's talking to Eisenhower about Vietnam, or Kennedy's talking to Eisenhower. There's a beautiful picture of them walking down a sidewalk during the Cuban Missile Crisis. In other words, previous presidents had someone else who had been in the job to talk to lean on for advice. Nixon didn't have that as he started to go through Watergate. Do you think it would have made a difference either in Nixon's actions or in the counsel he would have received? Say, for example, if Eisenhower, under whom Nixon had served as vice president, was still alive?
I'm not sure it would have made a huge difference because Nixon wasn't about to share all those kind of intimate details with one of his predecessors. I mean, actually, LBJ died in January of 73. And so that's a scene in my book when LBJ dies. And it's that point from late January 1973 that Nixon is the only surviving president. So it's interesting, but I don't think that made a huge difference to the way Watergate ended up.
In April, I believe it is April of 73, is when Haldeman, chief of staff, and John Ehrlichman, deputy chief of staff, basically his domestic policy advisor, they both had to go, and they were both let go by Nixon. How traumatic was that for President Nixon? And I forget the exact date in your book, so forgive me. I think it's in April of 73, where Nixon himself says, this is the day or the weekend when everything fell apart.
Right. All that happens in April of 1973. And as I said before, Nixon was not a good butcher. And he hated to get rid of anybody who was close to him. I mean, this is one of the differences between him and Donald Trump. I mean, Donald Trump went through 4 chiefs of staff in 4 years and fired some of them by tweet. But Nixon found it very painful to get rid of, even one chief of staff, Bob Haldeman. And when he finally understood that he had to sacrifice Haldeman in order to save his presidency, this is at the end of April 1973, he has a conversation with Haldeman that I quote in my book. And he says to Haldeman, I love you, son. He's calling him son by this stage. I love you like my brother.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's a reference to one of the brothers that one of Nixon's brothers who died from tuberculosis when Nixon was a young man. And this was a very traumatic event in Nixon's life, the deaths of 2 of his brothers from tuberculosis, but one in particular. And, when he says to Haldeman, I love you like my brother, I think, and everything else that is going on in Nixon's mind, I think that's illustrates how traumatic this was for him.
If Dean had kept his mouth shut, John Dean, counsel to the president, if he had just said, I'm just going to take the fall, I'll do my years, I'll write my book, I'll make a bunch of money, could that have stopped the momentum of Watergate?
Possibly, but by that stage, the momentum had sort of built up. And I think this house of cards that I was talking about would have cracked someplace else. I mean, also Jeb Magruder, who was being maneuvered into a situation where he had to take the fall. I'm not sure how long he would have lasted for. And he actually goes to the prosecutors within a few days of John Dean going to the prosecutors. It's, John Dean has, everybody talks about Dean because he became Nixon's main accuser, but he was just actually the first. I mean, a couple of days later, Jeb Magruder spills everything to the prosecutors. So even if Dean had remained loyal, this house of cards would probably have started falling in some other direction.
What did you think of the movie Nixon by Oliver Stone? Did you see it?
I haven't. I think I did watch it some years ago, but I haven't really. I can't remember enough of it to talk about it, really.
It's a terrific movie. Even if, whatever your feelings of Nixon on just visually and in terms of the writing, it's funny, for lack of a better term, but it comes off more sympathetic than you would think towards the president, who I think Oliver Stone said he voted for in 1968. Now there's some irony. Could you think of another, as we wrap up the podcast here with Michael Dobbs, author of King Richard Nixon and Watergate, An American Tragedy. Other Nixon books that you find compelling?
Well, I think John Farrell's biography of Nixon is the best single volume biography of Nixon. And I mean, he is not able to go into this this psychodrama of Nixon's final days in the way that I have, but because he is taking a sort of broader, bird's eye view of Nixon's entire career, whereas I'm just focusing on one particular slice of it. But if you want a good overall Nixon book, I think that Farrell's is as good as it gets, actually.
It is. I've read it, and it's wonderful. Actually, very well written. We have reached the point in the Leaders and Legends podcast where we ask the same 5 questions of all of our guests. I promise they're harmless, Mr. Dobbs. Question number 1: what was your first job?
Well, my first real job was working for Reuters news agency. I was hired as a graduate trainee, and so I went to work as a junior reporter for Reuters, and they sent me to Italy as one of their staff members in Italy. So my first job was for Reuters in Rome, which was a wonderful way to start a journalistic career.
Number 2, what was your first concert?
I wasn't much of a music buff, actually. So I'm, I can't, I mean, it was probably some concert at university, and it was probably not a rock concert, but a guitar concert. I saw the Spanish classical guitarist Segovia, I guess his name was.
Andre Segovia.
Mm-hmm. Right, at university. So that's the first one I really remember. Perhaps I'd been to others. Also, growing up in England, I went to the proms, and I remember going to the last night of the proms, which is a great English traditional events when people sing Land of Hope and Glory and so on, and Rule Britannia. So if you count that as a concert, but yeah, it wasn't a rock concert.
Question 3: if you could recommend any book for someone to read, which book would you choose?
Well, I've just actually finished rereading Anna Karenina by Tolstoy, and I think that's the greatest novel that's ever been written, because Tolstoy has a way of getting inside his characters and exploring their inner thoughts in a way that is authentic, and that has also impacted the way I myself write history, because I'm trying to get inside my characters, in this case Richard Nixon.
Number 4, if you could witness any event in history, be there as it happens, which event would you choose?
Well, I witnessed the collapse of communism personally, close up. So that was a pretty huge event that I, really marked my career, I guess. So I'm interested in revolutions. I'd probably say either the Russian Revolution or the French Revolution. Russian Revolution of 1917 or the French Revolution of 1789, when everything begins to fall apart. And do I have to just have one, or can I have 2?
You may have 2, sir.
Yeah, okay. Well, I have those 2 revolutions.
I was said at the beginning of the podcast where you watch Kennedy get off the plane in Dallas or Nixon as he goes through Watergate. It's extraordinarily sad to read about Nicholas II and his family, knowing how it ends for them in the basement at Ekaterinburg. Last question. If you could have dinner with anyone living today, 2 hours off the record, whom would you choose? Talk about anything.
Well, that's a good question, and I don't know who to choose there offhand. I'd have to think about that a bit. Probably, I don't think I'd choose a politician. I'd choose somebody else. So I have to think of somebody quickly. I know probably somebody like one of the, if the Steve Jobs was around, that would be interesting. Perhaps one of the sort of technological, not sure which one, but one of those people who have changed our world through technology.
You have been listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, a local veteran public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Girl Scouts of Central Indiana, Garmond Construction, Leaders and Legends LLC, the Grand Hall and Conference Center at Historic Union Station, the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn, and McAllister Machinery, your friendly neighborhood Caterpillar dealer. Our guest has been journalist and historian Michael Dobbs. We were discussing his latest book, King Richard, Nixon and Watergate, an American Tragedy. You may find Mr. Dobbs's books at michaeldobbsbooks.com. Thank you, sir, so very much for your time. I really enjoyed the discussion. It was a lot of fun.
Well, thank you. So did I.
Thank you very much for listening to Leaders and Legends, brought to you by Veteran Strategies Incorporated. If you want to contact us about this program or our menu of public relations services, please send us an email at robert@veteranstrategies.com. That's robert@veteranstrategies.com.